So this has been terrific, right? I mean, just such wonderful conversations this evening. Thank you so much for having me here. I want to start by talking about the most important question. Through all the talks we've heard today, the most important question is, what are the patterns of human relationships that need to be built for humanity to solve the problems we face today? And naturally, this is at the heart of how we rethink growth, how we think about a model of economic growth that achieves prosperity, not just for a few, but for as many people as possible. And in my work as an investment manager focused on Africa, I think a lot about this question of growth. And naturally, my mind tends to drift to some of the sacred writings in my faith. I'm a Baha'i. In short, Baha'is believe that all faiths are the same God and the destiny of humanity is world peace. And I've found the teachings of faith to be very, very powerful in the course of my career. And there's actually some beautiful ones on this subject of how two people should think about an economic transaction of giving a loan to one another, right? And the writings talk about how, in a spirit of amity and fellowship and joy and gladness, should be undergirding that transaction, right? And I don't know if you've ever done a Control F for any of these words in the annual reports of banks, but it's not a common thing that you encounter. And at the same time, if you talk to anybody who works inside of a bank, at the very heart of banking are these principles that you see on the screen: integrity, outward lookingness, vibrancy, community, fellowship, right? And the idea that relationships are important for economic growth, are important for business, is not a novel idea, right? I mean, we have this idea of networking, we have this idea of spaces like this where people come together, but oftentimes it is appropriated towards the goal of growth. Unicorns, right? We love growth. Billion-dollar companies, billion-dollar fundraisers, at this point, trillion-dollar companies, right? And the challenge is that oftentimes human relationships are applied for the purpose of growing enterprises bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the central things I will speak about across several case studies is that bigness is an inherent problem when we don't get the human relationships right. Scalability is inherently a problem if we don't have the right human relationships to undergird it. And I see this all the time in my work in sub-Saharan Africa. So over the past 5 years, there's been $309 billion of foreign direct investment in Africa. This is aid, this is money going into different companies, this is loans to governments. And in that same time period, we've had 3 governments that have gone bankrupt on the loans that they've been given, major economies in Africa. We've seen broad-based currency depreciation across most markets. Many investment projects have failed. In fact, on average, 27% of the average bank's loan book is non-performing. And there was a huge amount of companies are in economic distress despite the volume of money that is being poured into the problem. And many development economists see development aid as a very challenged enterprise. If anything, some might say a failed construct in many African countries. And the problem is that the size of the programs has prevented a degree of thinking about how these should be applied to solve real grassroots problems. And to look at another example before we dive more into that is in M&A, right? So M&A is perhaps the pinnacle example of growth, mergers and acquisitions. In other words, when 2 companies come together to form a bigger one, or one company acquires another. And what you find, what my alma mater discovered, a study actually just December of last year from NYU, Professor Lev, looked at 40,000 M&A transactions over the past couple of decades and found that only 25 to 30% of M&A transactions improve value over the long run. And I'm not talking about human well-being here. I'm actually talking about strictly cash flows. I'm talking about purely profitability. In other words, 70% of the time, you actually end up destroying cash flows. Instead of a situation where 2 plus 2 equals 5, right, where 2 companies come together and make something even better, it actually is more like 2 plus 2 equals 3, or in many cases, 2 plus 2 equals 1. The biggest challenge to M&A that the study found is that the cultures of two companies coming together have a lot of difficulty intertwining. In other words, it is a human problem, a deeply spiritual, social, personal problem of these two companies coming together. Do we have the right values in the way we combine our entities? And again, this is never something that's discussed in M&A perspectives, right? And you can kind of think about, okay, why are we so obsessed then with growth? Right? Why do we always, I had a professor who made this brilliant quip when asked, okay, if M&A fails at this level, why do people do it? Why do people try to grow their companies so big? And he gave a cheeky smile and he said, because the king always wants to grow the castle, right? But there is an economic logic that is described for why people try to grow their companies bigger and bigger and bigger, and that logic is economies of scale. So given I'm giving a TED talk, I have put a teddy bear factory on the screen here. And the logic's a little bit clear, right? If you have a huge factory that's producing a huge amount of goods, the cost of the factory is evenly dispersed across a very large volume of goods. And as a result, there's some economic benefits to being so big. And actually, you know, for manufacturing aerospace engineers in the audience and things like that, they know that there are some benefits to this. This is true. But more often than not, you actually end up with diseconomies of scale precisely because of the human conflicts that come inherent with scale. And we see this, for example, in the ecological crises that's facing our planet as a consequence of companies growing bigger and bigger and bigger, but not having foundational principles like an idea of altruism, an idea of fellowship, an idea of working together. These ideas are very difficult to introduce into a corporate setting. They're perhaps somewhat alien, despite the fact that anyone in any of these organizations would agree that that's what you want to hire for. That's what you want to work for with the people sitting next to you, right? And so our planet ends up in a situation where it faces many challenges because of this. Now, to explore this very concretely, I want to bring it back to markets in Africa. And I want to give you a case study of two companies I was looking at, both operating in small markets in Africa. On the, I guess from your perspective, left-hand side, we have Microfinance Bank A. On the right-hand side, we have Microfinance Bank B. Now, microfinance is very small loan sizes, averaging $40 for both banks. The one on the left is AI-enabled. It is a leading fintech company backed by a bunch of brand name venture capital firms that you probably have heard of. And this company has a $200 million loan book, which for Africa is quite big, especially doing $40 loans. And it uses this AI algorithm to disperse these loans and assess credit profiles. Now, the company on the right uses none of this fancy technology. It is entirely human-based. It has a $200,000 loan book that has grown organically across a population of about 7,000 people who pretty much know each other in some way or another. Rather than AI and digital interfaces, we're talking about humans that sit down with the local tailor and the local shoemaker and help them plan a budget for how they're going to use the $50 loan that they're receiving, right? So completely different enterprises in this sense. In fact, the one on the right is perhaps explicitly not scalable. And we're going to assess them across three boxing matches. The first is revenue growth. Microfinance Bank A seems to be winning, right? They're growing revenue at 130% plus, compared with Microfinance Bank B that's only growing at 18%, right? This is the power of scalability in action. But when we cut a layer deeper and we look at profitability, Microfinance Bank A is burning through cash. Now, at the same time, look, this is a fintech company. We know how startups work, right? They burn cash for a long time. When they get a big enough scale, then it doesn't matter because they can suddenly switch on the switch to profitability, and then everything's fine, right? So maybe we shouldn't worry too much about this. But at a basic level, we can see that Microfinance B is perhaps a little bit more sustainable in this perspective. But let's peel one layer further. Why is there this difference in profitability? Loan loss provisioning. These are non-performance rates. The bank on the left, for every dollar they lend out, 49% doesn't come back, right? In other words, half of the money lent out does not get repaid. Why would you repay a faceless AI that you have no relationship with, right? Whereas the bank on the right, 12% non-performance. Now still, these are high-risk markets, right? In Uganda, this is not an easy environment to build, so there's some non-performance. But let me ask you the question. If you're losing half the money right off the bat, what interest rate do you have to charge to break even? So let's do the math. $100 loan, right? $50 lost right off the bat. What percent do you have to charge on the other $50? Is it 50%? No, it's 100%. You have to double it. You have to double your money to break even before you even think about your other costs. So you're looking at what, interest rates of 150% plus, right? That sounds about right. And that's what they charge. Microfinance Bank B, because it has a lower loss ratio, can charge much lower interest rates. It can create a model of growth that is sustainable, that is community-led. Now, the paradox is, as a fund, Microfinance Bank B is too small for me to even look at. My transaction fees, my legal fees would exceed the value of the transaction. So what do? We have to get a little bit more creative. What would it look like, for example, if we were able to, rather than funding a singular large microfinance bank that's super scalable, where only a couple people accrue all of the profits that come in? What if we funded a federation of very small microfinance banks? Right? These are economic models that have not been built before, that are rooted in community. And I want to give you a couple other case studies. But before that, I want to introduce you to a man called Mr. Schumacher. He wrote a book in 1973 called Small is Beautiful. Formerly, he headed industrial policy for the United Kingdom. And he said, if human vices such as greed and envy are systematically cultivated, the inevitable result is nothing less than a collapse of intelligence. A man driven by greed or envy loses the power of seeing things as they really are, of seeing their roundness and wholeness. And his very successes become failures. If whole societies become infected by these vices, they may achieve astonishing things, but they become increasingly incapable of solving the most elementary problems of everyday existence. And so we have enormous scale, trillion-dollar companies in my home city of New York, right next to people who are unsheltered, sleeping rough on the streets. This is the problem with the growth model that we've undertaken. And it's interesting because my very first job coming out of university was co-founding an organization to do some research into this problem of homelessness. When you're going to school in New York, you pass by homeless people every single day. And it's deeply perplexing, right? How could it be that we cannot solve this most elementary problem, but we can make AI that I can talk to? That's crazy. And we discovered that the problem is not a technical problem. It's a spiritual problem. It's a human problem. It's about the way we treat one another. What we found of the 1,500 people who we interviewed who were sleeping rough in New York City, which at the time was the largest data set that had ever been collected on street homelessness in New York, we found that the reason why people failed to end chronic homelessness, in other words, they failed to be able to escape being homeless for more than a period of 2 years, was because the systems that were designed to help them did not necessarily make them feel like a human being. It was the level of the relationships they were building. And at the same time, when you meet people who work in shelters, they're deeply good-intentioned people. So what is the problem? How do we design a system that is more human in its character? I think part of the problem is we focus too much on just trying to put beds, on trying to put together trainings, trying to put together food, and we don't think enough about what are the kinds of relationships we're building. Just because we get someone off the street does not mean that they have a community to enter into. It does not mean that they have meaningful friendships. We don't always think about these sorts of challenges. And another element we found is that even at a level of why people become homeless in the first place, there are many different reasons that one might describe: economic reasons, eviction reasons, addiction reasons, psychological reasons, a whole range of things. But fundamentally, homelessness occurs when a person has no social support system to turn to. When you have nobody that you're able to be taken in by. That is ultimately what occurs when someone becomes homeless. And what we also discovered is that there are many cultures that have very high rates of poverty in New York City, but where you do not find high rates of homelessness, right? Because where there is a culture of vibrancy, a culture of common support, of mutual aid, this problem does not exist. So now how do we take that idea and transcend it beyond a singular culture or a singular religion or a singular background and encompass the entirety of the human race, where we are here for one another because we are brothers, we are sisters, we are friends. This is a model of growth that is very different than what we're looking at in most of our markets today. And it sounds really pie in the sky. So I want to give you a couple really practical examples of this happening. The car club. So the last time I was in Cape Town, I was doing some research on the auto lending sector, and I began asking people how they got financing for their cars, if they're Uber drivers, right? And what I discovered is, of course, banks don't service the Zimbabwean migrants who come to South Africa. And so they have to figure out some creative solutions. And the main solution that many people rely on is the car club. And you won't read about this in any newspaper. There's no studies that have been done on it, but there should be. But there are basically these groups of people who come together and they pool together money and they buy cars for people who present themselves to the group. And the rule is you do not have to pay interest. You don't even have to pay back the loan that was given to you for the car. You just join the group and help buy the next person the car. And when you're in the group for life. This is a banking model founded on altruism. It's a banking model founded on the principle that the whole is greater than the individual. The Bayan Association in Honduras is a more formalized example of this sort of model, where a community in Honduras raises charitable aid to train financial literacy in bank managers. But the money is pooled together by the community, and loans are made by a democratically elected board created by the community. Profits are shared among all the people involved, and the community is able to run its own banking, by the way, at non-performance rates that are significantly lower than fintech companies operating in the same market. So this is not pie in the sky. The way it happens is in our daily lives, by exploring how do we build vibrant and outward-looking communities. How do we move beyond the people we know through our profession, the people we know because of our common ethnicity? You know, my mother's from Pakistan, my dad's from Texas, and Pakistanis are quite vibrant when they're together, yet it's not always so outward-looking, right? And similarly, cultures that are very, very outward-looking are not necessarily always vibrant. If you have lots of different people of different backgrounds, you don't have the same vibrancy of when I go to my auntie's house and she's making nahari, right? So we have to crack this problem of, in our daily lives, at our dinner tables, how do we build vibrant community that involves people of many different backgrounds? And when we do that, we will rethink growth and achieve something that looks far different today and will attain a level of prosperity, not for a few, but for all, in a way that we can scarcely imagine. So thank you very much, guys. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.